Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Zenitsu, and you're listening to the Digi Talks podcast, the show that covers various topics from news to meta developments and everything in between for the fine folks who love the Digimon trading card game. Just as a quick reminder, I do stream this live over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, and it's also uploaded on the YouTube channel of Zenitsu, as well as being broadcasted on several different podcasting platforms like Spotify for your viewing and listening pleasure. Please feel free to leave a rating, like, follow, and subscribe and review, depending on the platform that you're listening on, if you want to support the channel and support the show. Today, we're going to be with my co host Mark and my teammate Headless Honcho. I guess Mark is technically my teammate. We just haven't actually met to, be called a teammate. Same thing with Teddy, but Teddy is out today. He is sick. So I have two very fine gentlemen as the substitutes and replacements. And they are people who I hold with great respect for. And today we are going to be talking about how we define tier 0 and what makes a deck tier 0. But with Teddy's exclusion, he did actually send me a question for this week's weekly question, which is going to be: were there any formats that you guys or gals believe felt tier 0 in the Digimon TCG? So, Mark, why don't you lead us with your answer to this question? Because I know tier 0 is a pretty heated topic, and we're going to get to that, but after we answer this question, we do have a little bit of event data to go over.
Yeah, of course. It's a pretty in-depth topic to talk about, and many factors describing it, what classifies as tier 0. But I think the only one I can think of right off the bat is probably the most memorable that maybe a few old school Digimon players remember, is when Blue Hybrid first became a deck. That meta was very, very heavily loaded with nothing but blue hybrids. To the point, I think I'm going off a whim, but I think like maybe at least more than 40, maybe almost 50% of topping decks were blue hybrid in that meta. And I think that was probably the most memorable one.
Headless, what format do you think we have ever been in a tier 0 format?
So, unfortunately, I didn't start playing Digimon competitively until BT8, so I can't go too far back. For the most part, I felt like most of the formats, like BT8 onward, were pretty good. Like, there's some level of diversity. It's a lot of, like, checks and balances. You do have, like, big OTK metas, but for the most part, it's kind of just who gets to go off first and see their pieces rolling. It's never really, like, one deck is clearly gonna win, like, more often than any of the others. But, I think right now, this EX5 meta is probably, like, the first time that I've truly believed that we're in, like, a true tier 0 format.
I kind of think both of your answers are correct. Unfortunately, we won't have a whole lot of EX5 data to basically, prove this, but I do actually have the BT7 data because my channel is a great time capsule for the history of the game. Just because I've been recording and doing content from the very beginning. And looking back at the data, I can say that, Mark, you actually were pretty close in terms of your guesstimation on how prevalent blue hybrids was. It reached as high as 55% of all topping decks. And even though that was a slightly shorter format, we still had enough time and a couple of events to have like a top breakdown. And blue hybrids definitely choked the ever living crap out of that format, where the only other deck that was able to do relatively well in any capacity was yellow hybrids, and it still lost to blue hybrids. So yeah, it blue hybrids definitely was a tier 0 deck for the format that was in. And the funny thing was, it should have been tier 0 going into BT8, but the community magically decided to agree not to play the deck for some reason, which was kind of bizarre and surprising to me, but it made me happy nonetheless to not see blue hybrids all the time, even though I was part of the problem. But like going back into EX2 data, that's when like pre limitations put onto Tommy was in place, and that was the last format that blue hybrids was at full capacity until the unrestriction, of course. And that was basically dominating EX2, which made me believe that, like, oh, if people just played the deck in BT8, it still actually would have been the best deck in that format. So that's kind of funny. And then obviously we all know what happened with Nationals this time around, with Anubis being 39% representation of top 64 for the North American regionals, which had 900 plus players. So that's pretty good conversion rate in terms of like what was actually able to top and how many were able to build the deck. So as far as just going over some more event data, there was a small event in Houston, Texas. It was at TCG Con. There was about 40 players. It was 4 rounds of Swiss. And I'm just going to be briefly glossing over top 8 because all of these decks we know about, all of these decks we've seen before, and there's not really anything new or surprising here. So first place that took it was actually a Machinedramon list. So cool to see Machinedramon still able to do well. I think he just has a lot of tools and a lot of different ways to build them. It just takes a hardcore, dedicated specialist to be able to do well with it. Second place was Black War Greymon. Third place was Divas. Fourth place was Beelstar. Fifth place was Security Control. Sixth place, Red Hybrids. Seventh place was Heavy Leomon. This was using a more green gotcha style, but it was still at the end of the day just let me use Heavy Leomon, Fortitude, and then de-digivolve and control, and like, you know, deck's kind of just silly like that. Then eighth place was another Security Control. So the only interesting thing is a lot of what we would think would be like in the upper echelons, about half of those decks just weren't here, but that's probably because it was a small event limited to whoever was in Houston, Texas at the time. So it was basically like a super locals. So that is the event data that we have. But going into the topic of back to tier 0, I think for that event, it speaks volumes to maybe nobody brought Anubis, or maybe nobody good was on Anubis to be able to do well. And like this whole question of tier 0 comes from the fact that we already know Apocalypse or Apocaly is getting hit in BT 15, and he as a deck is absolutely disgusting and dominated the Japanese format. And the only thing that was actually legal for BT 15 in terms of like the ability to fight against Apocaly was Anubis. So like there's that cyclical, these are the two best decks. They do well against each other and keep each other in check, but they're the only things that are basically playable. And based on what we saw in Nationals, I think like Anubis is kind of just that broken. Obviously, he's getting restricted, but this spurred the idea on like, what do we define as tier 0? Because other games, they have their own definitions of tier 0 based on the different metrics that they're looking at. I know when looking at the conversation of tier 0, anyone who brings up 65% is a Magic player. Magic the Gathering, the game that I had a lot of extensive experience with, their metric for tier 0, which they actually have defined in an article, is when a deck's win percentage is at 65% or above, that's when they label it as tier 0, and something from that deck is going to get limited or restricted. In Magic's case, they don't actually have anything that's limited, so it's just something's going to get banned once something hits that threshold. So there have been plenty of toxic decks that have just slid under that percentage to where Magic just didn't do anything at all. So that is their metric. I think with Digimon, the way it works, we kind of need a different metric. So, Headless, what do you think is your own personal metric for what do you constitute as tier 0?
Right. So, I get what you're saying about win rates and everything, but Digimon is a lot of the times kind of just variants and coin flips. We have an entire system where you have effectively a secondary hand that can like give you free options, it can give you free tamers. And so a lot of the times decks kind of win and lose based on random chance. Like it's a little sad to say, like there is player skill involved in this card game. It's knowing like certain points to push people and like when it's appropriate for you to move out of raising or make unsafe attacks. But at the end of the day, like everything's kind of like coin flips and like just if I attack now and give him a tamer, like that basically like cinches the game for him. Like, and knowing the like percentage and odds of those happening are gonna be how you define good players from bad players. But realistically, for me, a tier 0 deck is a deck that is inherently unfair. Like, it has either resource loops or like combos that make it effectively like uninteractable with. So right now in this current era of the card game, we're getting lots of boss monsters that have like can't be affected by Digimon effects or can't be affected by effects in general. And you would think that that would constitute like a tier 0 sort of deck, but the biggest problem is that a lot of those big new flashy boss monsters take a considerable investment to actually get into. And what we're seeing is that the ones that really take like very little investment to get into are the ones that are actually going to be like tier 0. I think right now it's a resource game. So Anubismon I think is where we're at for a tier 0 deck, because as you go through your combo, as you're um, evolving up in the stack, you can basically just see all your pieces and go off immediately. Whereas like other decks in that same ilk that we were seeing before, like Lugamon, is entirely you have to set up first. So you set everything up, your opponent gets to see you setting up, they can respond at certain points while you are doing your setup, but that's just not the case for Anubismon. So you'd have to catch them in quite the funny predicament, because in most cases, Anubismon can be off to the races and have 2 megas on board by turn 2. So I think right now, any deck that can consistently establish 2 megas by turn 2, they're in consideration for being a tier 0 deck.
Because I know, like, just bouncing off of your thought,
Mm-hmm.
like, just after experiencing playing against the deck with multiple different decks, most decks actually don't have the ability to respond to 2 megas by turn 2. If they're lucky, they even have a response to one of them, and that's not including an option. Like, setting up, doing your combo, and then using an option, leaving the opponent an exuberant amount of memory to be able to reestablish, is like the only actual way. And most of the time, there's still 2 extra bodies that you just can't deal with. So I think like that is a pretty interesting perspective on what you define as tier 0, because I do think Digimon is a resource game, and I do think that a lot of the player skill is more risk analysis and mitigation. And like that just goes hand in hand with how efficient certain decks are and can perform. And I think like I've been in this mindset where stack decks versus hard play decks. Like hard play decks are more consistent than stack based decks, but when a stack based deck is hyper consistent, its ceiling, like its damage ceiling and play ceiling, is way higher than anything a hard play style deck can accomplish. And I think kind of what you were saying is like when a deck can establish itself too quickly and leave itself with such a demanding board state that the opponent really just doesn't have a way of being able to accommodate for in any capacity across the entire field, that yeah, I can see where you're coming from with your thoughts on tier 0. What about you, Mark? Because I know you have a different perspective.
I think it's interesting. I agree with Headless's points. Um, like whether it's different functionalities in the deck or a plethora of things, how an opponent can deal with their top board state that you would have. But I also would like to add the factor in of basically how we were discussing the win rate, or the topping rate for the deck, and I think that's a key factor. But also, as an example, let's say on average for Digimon, usually like when we had Shine Gray, Anubis right now, Blue Hybrid, like they've all been at least above, I believe, like 40% roughly. So I feel like if we come across a deck that's 40%, we also want to consider maybe like what is the entirety of the play rate of that deck, because a deck, we got to establish the difference between a deck being good and a player being good, because if 40% of, say, Anubismon topped, but only about 4% of the entirety of decks were Anubis, you got to consider that being a player skill rather than a deck skill, because if a deck is so broken and super consistent, or in many plethora of ways, even an average player can get to a top position with how crazy a deck can be. So that's another factor I feel like we have to look at. And a key example for tier zeros, I mean, as he talked about with different broken functionalities or play styles, I'm a hardcore player of this deck, but I think it's a great example of that because it has the potential to be it, and that's Machine Dramon. Machine Dramon has a excruciatingly annoying method of protection that almost I would say about 70% of decks can't handle right away, at least not without giving that same opponent a plethora of memory. Um, but the difference between like Apocalypse or Anubis and that deck is solely consistency. Machine Dramon is not the most consistent deck, while its ceiling is super high and potentially tier zero uh, playability, as far as what it can do and what it has and what it is potential is, its consistency brings it down. And I feel like that's also something that can define a tier zero, is not just one factor. It has to be a plethora of factors, because it's not just Machine Dramon. There are plenty of other decks that have the potential to be tier zero, but there is a default in that deck that stops it from being that high. And as we've seen with Anubis and Apocalypse, they just don't have that defect right now. They will once the ban list comes out, but they don't at the moment, and that's why they're getting the ban list.
Yeah, I think conversion rate is definitely a huge factor. I think that's probably the biggest metric in Digimon. What I've been going off of for a while, because we unfortunately don't have the widespread availability of all of the data that, we would want and like. Some of it is a little bit unrealistic, like matchup result data. Like, unless you're putting that together yourself from your own personal experience or getting a pool with a whole bunch of people and just throwing hands and getting that stuff, we're realistically never going to see it, and there's no way to calculate it efficiently enough to be as accurate as what we want. So I've just been doing the rough estimation on like what's been in top 16. I would love to add conversion rate to that, but unfortunately we just don't get those numbers.
I
But
can agree. It's like Headless said, it's a very coin flip game. Like if you compare it to uh, just a small example, quick example with One Piece, when it comes to draw power, and like most Digimon players say, is seeing their pieces. It's very easy to see your pieces with One Piece because of their mechanic of their life goes straight to your hand if it's hit. That's a free draw on top of all the other draws you can get. But with Digimon, it's a lot more difficult. You have to rely on effects of your Digimon by either playing them or digivolving. You get one free draw, so the game is very luck based, and even a very skilled deck can still sometimes lose really, really hard to just plain out luck.
yeah. And that's why like the metric that I've been going with is just representation in top 16s. So I've been keeping track of that data, gosh, probably since BT7. And I've noticed a couple of trends from utilizing that data set and the way I've been gathering it. And that is when a deck usually hits at about 35% top representation, or more, I notice a couple of things start happening. Uh, the first thing is usually there's only one other deck that is able to go toe to toe and counteract the deck. That's like what we saw with blue hybrids being like 55% representation, and then like the remaining like 15% just under that was yellow hybrids. Yellow hybrids wasn't keeping it in check, but between those two decks, it was really putting this chokehold on the format where a lot of the other decks either A, just couldn't top because, you know, they were being beat out by blue or yellow hybrids, or B, was lucky, dodged them, and or just was lucky and beat them and just squeak their way into top percents, having such a very low, insignificant number, but it's still represented because it actually did get there. I've noticed this a couple of times. The other big one that happened was that I actually have records of was BT11 with Black War Greymon X before his limitation, where it was basically if you weren't playing Black War Greymon or you weren't playing Grandis, you were basically having a very hard time. And then obviously now with Anubis, Anubis is in a particular interesting spot because he actually doesn't have that counterbalance. It literally is Anubis at the top, and then everything else basically got lucky, and a few decks were able to have a better matchup spread against the rest of the field that wasn't Anubis, or even slight advantages against Anubis, which was Mirage and Red Hybrids, which was why, compared to some of the others, they were able to win a little bit more consistently and do a little bit better than everything else. But usually in these like 35 and up percentages, that's when like one deck is just absolutely dominating everything with an iron grip, and it usually puts a chokehold on the rest of the format. So
That's
Shine,
something I want to talk about.
yeah,
About Anubis. Is Anubis being a trash-based strategy generally means that it has like pretty clear-cut like weaknesses, and it was a deck that everybody knew was going to be a problem. Everybody had tech cards in their deck. If you were running red, you were generally running Crimson Blaze. You maybe had some of the Floodgate rookies, like you know your Sykes or your can't be played by effect types. Like so, the fact that it still is 25 out of the top 64 decks just speaks volumes about like what that deck can do. Because even with all the tech cards that everybody was running, even other Anubis mons are running tech cards for Anubis mons. The fact that it still saw that much success just goes to show you how like inherently broken like some of these trash-based strategies are. Like it's going to be the same issue for Apocalypse, where it's legal for its 2 weeks. Like the fact that too many decks in our formats can't deal with mill. There's nothing you can do if you're playing. Let's say you're playing Mirage, and for whatever random reason, they make you mill 3 burst modes. You basically are done with the game. At that point, like it's I have to look at the board state. Can I realistically get there in time without my actual win con? Like,
yeah, the
and that
game, it wasn't exactly built in particular ways to have as good of checks and balances as others, which obviously is what we're finding out right now. We've been bitching and complaining about security control for a very long time, and they've been making strides to try to keep that deck in check as much as it possibly can, but it only like realistically does well when the toxicity of the format is at like its highest. Which I find very ironic. One of the most toxic decks that's trying to abuse the systems and mechanics of the game only does well when other decks are trying to abuse the system and mechanics of the game in other areas.
right. Setcon is realistically there to prey on all of these like when you really look at them on paper, very greedy decks. Like Mirage is extremely greedy. Like, oh, my entire game plan hinges on me getting to a level 7 and messing with your hand enough that I can just swing forever, basically. So the same with like Luga in last format. Like Lugamon was again just an extremely greedy deck. Like you can complain about that format, but like realistically, when you go back and think about it, it was a pretty fair deck. Like it took you on average like 3 turns to set up. Like the fastest you could realistically go off was turn 3. like compared to what we're at now, where on
Where
turn two,
turn
yeah,
2, Anubis just goes off.
yeah. And I think that's like the big thing for Tier 0 is, of course, like seeing this representation, but also being able to like meter that out with the fact that like the entire regionals, nationals format was warped around Anubis. Where if you were not on Anubis, you had to have game plans for Anubis.
Yeah, and like before in BT14, just as a stark contrast, there was actually no definitive like top deck. Like there was a multitude of decks that were doing well and having good representation across the field. Like BT14 was one of the more healthier formats in the entire game. BT12 post Beelzemon was that. Beelzemon also was another deck while he was unrestricted for his short period of time. He actually was hitting some of those insane numbers, but that was more because of like the speed of which the deck was able to high roll at versus like because it really just hinged on what you were self milling, determined how much farther you can push that deck. And the Impmon that just let you milled even more, it was the deciding factor to just push that over the edge, making its milling potential way higher, which obviously made the deck perform insanely well. But it seems like, as much as I hate to say it, Digimon just needs more checks and balances for certain mechanics and interactions. Like, we do have a couple of decks that have ways to be able to refill the trash back into your deck, but we don't actually have a whole lot of grave-based interactions to really keep a lot of purple decks in check. We have very minimal amount of them. Same thing with like interaction with security. Outside of burning the security, the only other way to interact with it is to hit it. And yellow is a color that just uses it as a secondary resource, similar to purple, but it has more limitations because there's not as many cards that you could A, put in there, B, already in there, and C, like, use and reuse. But
Right.
we just, like, it seems like when we get into these tier 0 situations, it does fall down to two major factors, which one is the speed and consistency of the deck, and the second is the deck's overall game plan and how players are able to respond to it. So, like, what makes Anubis so broken is because it checks both of those boxes, where it's just like, you can't interact with me, or you can hardly interact with me, and I move faster and can do anything and everything because I have good offensive and defensive game plans for basically doing exactly what I want to do, which is just digivolve up to one, like digivolve up once, discard everything, and then boom, I'm done. Apocalypse a similar way with the Gurumon engine, which is why that's getting hit, where it's just like, I'm gonna go up the Gurumon chain, put everything into my trash, draw everything I need, and then play Apocalypse, and then make you not be able to interact with Apocalypse, and then he's just going to sit there, mill your deck out, and then, haha, GG. I don't even need to hit your security to trigger anything. So, those are what I'm noticing in terms of, like, how a deck gets to tier 0. Because at the end of the day, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we could spin and, like, correlate on what tier 0 is and like our own personal definitions of it, but when it comes to like looking at the actual game, those are the two big factors, which not a lot of decks hit, and different decks will hit it at different times. Like blue hybrids right now, just as an example, you try playing that deck, it's nowhere near the same as what Anubismon is doing right now, and it's not hitting the same highs as what it did in BT7 because the game is just fundamentally different.
I think Digimon has been at least pretty decent with the fact of keeping us from hitting tier 0 decks pretty often. I mean, we've had, I'd say, what, four so far since the game has started. I'm not sure if we had anything before BT4 when I started, but I think they've been pretty good with it, and I think a big part of that is the one box you were just discussing, and that's how well other decks can counter certain decks that might be potentially tier zero. And I think because of how much minor support their sets usually bring to almost all topping decks, to make them even just a little bit stronger each set has kept every single topping deck in check. And I think the only rare occurrences of top tier zero decks becoming to light is really when they take giant leaps to try new things. Like with Apocalypse Mon, they tried going with this trashing cards out of your opponent's deck rapidly. They really wanted to go with that approach, and we've seen it. We've seen it before with Creepy Mon and what is it? The Gallant Mon line, the red and purple Gallant Mon line.
Yeah,
The
Chaos
the
Galley
Willis
It,
stuff.
yeah.
it was never that strong, not strong enough to warrant. Okay, I need to worry about this. This is something I'm seeing everywhere, and I just can't win because they decked me out. But then they saw it and they were like, let's take a new approach. Let's take it a step higher. But they went too far, and that's usually when we get tier zero decks is when Bandai decides to take some kind of giant leap at either a new idea or extending onto a not really so looked at play style of a deck as like with Apocalypse Money was milling your opponent's deck, you know. And I think they've been pretty good, It hasn't been like, every set there's a tier zero. It's been far from that. And I think they've been doing really well at least. We have to give credit to that at least.
If we were talking the metas of strictly like the sets, there would be, because realistically, like, we get a couple decks out of every set, and some of those decks are a lot stronger than other decks, or more complete too. So like, realistically, if we were just talking about BT13 cards, like the only thing that you'd be able to say are like the strongest decks would have been Royal Knights and Belfry, just straight out of the box, right? But because we get to stay in like a format that lets us use legacy support, I think that keeps things a little bit better. Where sometimes those legacy decks like just get so much stuff that certain cards end up being traps, or like they bog you down. Like, I think it's very interesting that a deck with as many tools and as much power as it has, being like Black War or any of the like Greymon stuff, didn't make it at all into day two for Nats. There's not a single Greymon, like basically anything, for top 64.
Yeah, not even Shine Greymon, which was like BT13's darling because it just had some absolutely insane plays. But I think that is just because the the way the game has been changing. It's not like it's not allowing those decks to do well. It's just there's player attention is very hard to get into keep, especially with constantly bombarding players with new stuff. And like that deck has to truly be something special in order for players to want to keep playing it, or it constantly gets support, which is why like they'll every now and then just throw older decks a bone just to be like, hey, this is gonna be good for this deck, like what we saw with the promo Seedramon for Aegis-Dramon, because realistically right now that's like the only deck that's able to do it. And like we saw that with Skull Knightmon and Bagramon, because Bagramon didn't see like any meaningful updates until it got that Skull Knight promo,
Mm-hmm.
and like that was enough to be able to, in a Bagra specific player's hands, take it into day two over something like Greymon. Again, variance in terms of matchups and what they were able to see and the opponents that they played against, that's always going to be a factor. But the fact that there was just so many people playing Greymon as a whole for a very long time, and the deck never really got, in quotation marks, worse. Um, it was, yes, very surprising that no
I have a
Greymons got
correction
into.
I need to make. I'm looking at the list again, and there is a single blue flare. So I guess you have your Greymon rep there, but still.
I don't. I guess it's technically Greymon because it's using Metal Greymon, but like that
Mm-hmm.
deck's more of like it's not. It's like a soft OTK deck where it's just like, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you have a wide field, turn your blockers/attackers off, and then just try to hit you multiple times. Like it feels kind of just like a worse version of Mirage at that point. Like deck rolls is also something that would help divide player attention, because if I were like I could say I'm a Lugamon player. I have the deck built. I play it casually. I really like what it's doing. But if I was to take Lugamon competitively, there's zero reason to actually have Lugamon when I have Anubismon. So
Exactly.
like he just gets completely overshadowed because you have two decks fulfilling the same role, but one is doing it vastly better than the other. It's the same thing with why would I ever play Millith and spend 50 minutes on one single turn to mill you out when I could just play Apocalypse for 3, end of turn, mill 10. Like,
Hmm.
it doesn't make sense for me as a player to put that much more effort into a worse version of the same deck to get the same type of result. And I
Yeah.
think like that's something that Bandai kind of needs to do a little bit better of a job on, is clearly defining what, not necessarily the gimmick of the deck is, but like what the goal of the deck is and how it varies from other decks. Because we get these like I guess villain decks. It's not always villain decks, but it just feels like they're villain decks. Villain decks most of the time are just basically this weird augmented version of a clock deck. So it's just like we had it started all the way back in EX2 with D Reaper. Like D Reaper was the first instance of a clock deck. Then
Hmm.
we had a better clock deck in the form of Royal Knights, and then we had a better clock deck in the form of what's going to be an EX6, the um Demon
Demon
Lords
Lords.
deck.
Even more.
It's just like it's the same idea, just done slightly differently. And like it kind of makes certain decks just kind of feel irrelevant, because without any new support to help push it forward, you're just if you want to play that style of deck, you're just going to transition to the next best thing. And like that's why certain decks kind of fall off. Similarly to Machine Dramon, it's just like, why would I play Machine Dramon when I'm just going to throw out Bancho Leomon that basically is doing almost the same thing. It's a hard to kill body, it's a good defensive body to stop the opponent from attacking. It's very annoying when it does die or you attempt to kill it, and then he just consistently can go up his chain and beat you in the face and do other things. It's like, it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Um,
Hmm.
Not saying that Machine Dramon is bad. It literally just topped in Texas, so it's not bad. It's just that's why I think the game kind of needs more deck specialists, and them not rapid firing out new decks at the rate that they are. Because Japan is like the most guilty of it, where it's just like, oh, new deck came out, let's drop the old one immediately.
Yeah.
I
Like
think I can
you'll.
agree.
Hmm.
I can agree to a sense. Um, and I think yes, we should spend. It's hard to define it because like we should be spending more time on these original decks that come out and just giving them even the tiniest bit of support to keep up with the meta that comes out after set after set. But at the same time, it's a hard factor to hit because you know there's also that situation where we could spend too much time with certain decks and that people get annoyed with it, and people do get easily annoyed um, with with an idea or a deck or a meta that goes on for just a little too long. People will get annoyed, and that's why it's such a hard factor to hit. Where you don't want that, where a new deck that plays just like an old deck comes out and it replaces it, and then it keeps going on and on and on. But you also don't want to stick with the same deck for too long without seeing anything really fresh.
I mean, are we seeing anything fresh though at this point? Like I mean that like in a genuine sense. Like it doesn't feel like we're seeing anything, like any new roles or styles of deck prop up. Like
like
Because
even looking ahead, right, with like the upcoming stuff. So we go back into some DNA meta for BT16. We get like all the O2 characters again. Partition's kind of cool. It unfortunately doesn't, do everything that you'd want it to do. Like the fact that it's just effect removal and it can't be your own effects. You can't like realistically loop it, which would have been very funny, but can't be done. Like weirdly enough, we have like brand new keywords that pop up, but we just haven't seen again. So like when we realistically think about it, we have EX5 gave us a brand new keyword, Fortitude, which is only found on like the Leomon family and then in the Makurimon like line. But that keyword has yet to show up again. We have not seen that coming in BT15, which we're in now. We don't see that in BT16. We don't see it in EX6. Like, interestingly enough, they seem to be wanting to try these new keywords, but they're not giving us like actual support for them. In the same kind of like negative factor that was like some of the now defunct keywords, like Digiburst. I don't think Digiburst is ever gonna come back in a meaningful way because it's inherently like a neg. Like we're a card game where we care so much about inheritables, where sometimes you'll play an inferior like base effect body for a good inheritable.
I think Digiburst was a good idea for the time, but I also think they reached the pinnacle of Digiburst too quickly to want to revisit it. Because, like, we already had basically all of our staple abilities attached to what Digiburst is doing. And then on top of that, a lot of the good Digiburst stuff basically just OTK the opponent, which they realized just, oh, I guess that's not a good idea. I mean, granted, Black War Greymon from BT, like the promo Black War Greymon didn't get hit, but especially considering how stupid Greymon stacks can get, which is weird, but Grandis got hit because it used Digiburst after its inheritable was done. It just didn't functionally matter, so it was able to throw it away without any consequence. Kind of similar with Greymon, but like because he has more continuous stuff going on, it's a little bit more dicey to throw away your inheritables because then you'd be losing DP half the time, making your attacks riskier as it goes on. But like Grandis had like zero problems just throwing away all of its inheritables. But like Digiburst, I think they just realized how bad of a keyword that was and how quickly they developed the design space for it and just saw no need to continue. I do think like Alliance needs to spread some more wings outside of just Lotmon and then just a couple of like tamer cards.
Right, because right now we have Alliance via in purple for AG. We have it. You're gonna get it for black via Julien. You'll get it from the Angemon that comes in EX6. We'll give it to yellow. And then otherwise right now it's mainly a green keyword, which makes enough sense. Green's whole thing has been for a while, kind of go wide. And suspending your own guys, so like all that made enough sense to start you there. Which is kind of why it's weird that Fortitude like ended up being like green color pied for using a magic term, but for its initial run when realistically to me, its flavor and everything feels kind of like it should have been a black keyword.
I mean,
But I
technically the cards are green black, except for the one mono green card that you said. But I feel like green is probably like their testing ground for mechanics
well,
for whatever
you
reason.
also yeah, weirdly enough, it probably is. But you do also see it on the other ultimate in the Leo family, which is the yellow green.
Oh, that is true.
So all of them do share green as a color. Like we don't have anything that doesn't. Black is getting a new keyword in Collision, but it's again in one family line, and we don't see it popping up anymore. So unsure about if that keyword's gonna spread.
And I think like when it comes to not only just keywords but mechanics, it's like usually, as much as I hate to say it, usually the new stuff is just vastly superior more often than not than a lot of the older stuff that's currently out. I get that's the idea to try to sell things, but like usually we only get these like tier 0 formats when the
From brand new
mechanic
stuff, yeah.
yeah, when the mechanic is pushed that much farther. So like just taking a look at some of the bans and restrictions, just going a little bit into the history of them. We had HPD, which came out in BT3, and immediately it was legal at full power for 2 weeks. Doesn't this sound familiar? Before BT4 comes out in the spring. Doesn't this sound familiar? But anyway, then we get like Eisbahn and Eisbahn Scatter Mode, where they had a hot minute where they allowed some degenerate combo, utilizing the new DNA mechanic and just accelerating the speed of purple setup, and now they're both limited to 1. You had Ice Wall, which just a new card came out, immediately limited to 1 right afterward. Like, it seems like we get this trend where whenever they do something incredibly stupid that breaks the game really hardcore, it is almost rarely from something older. It's always from something newer, which I think is like really a bad position to be in, because most of the time when a lot of card games like hit a card, it's usually not on the most recent stuff, or they try not to have it be on the most recent stuff. Like seeing the Gabumons get hit, that's like, oh, yeah, there is no other card that does what that does, and it is enabling too much because draw 2, discard 1 is kind of stupid on an on-delete inheritable ability. Pair that up with, like, a million other cards that on-delete draw 1, discard 1. It's just like, you kind of start to see where they start backing up in terms of how they were designing cards in the future versus some retroactive cards. Like, obviously, the Power 9 in Magic is, like, the biggest deal in the world because of this, and it's, like, banned in almost every format because of that, in terms of Eternal formats. So it's, like, seeing Digimon literally create something new, break the game in half, everyone flocks to it, and then they have to hit something, it's a very depressing pattern. And at Nationals, when they said that the new director, when they mentioned new director, I was just like, what happened to the old one?
Mm-hmm.
So that didn't give me the best of confidence, and hopefully, I don't know when the director shift changed, but hopefully this new director sees what Apocalypse and Anubis did compared to the entire history of the game, and just look hard at it and be like, let's never try to do that again.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has, like, when you look at other card games, I think it's motivated by greed. Like, Magic had a very bad spell of, like, where just brand new cards would come out, like, you'd be in a brand new set, and you just bans left and right. Like, I want to say, I can't remember the
BFC.
exact year.
BFC.
Yeah, there was that one year where, like, normally they add very few cards to the ban list, but I think, I want to say, like 2021 or something, they added like 25 cards to the
Yeah,
ban list.
it started with Eldrazi Winter.
Yeah.
And then it literally lasted all the way through, like, Call Time. I know these are just Magic terms and Magic sets, but that was like a solid 2 or 3 year chunk of, like, cards where they were banning stuff immediately, and they were just banning stuff left and right because of, like, incredibly poor design choices that they made.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure it's all just that they wanted to have these very pushed cards for the express purpose of just moving more product.
I mean, Magic's in a very bad state right now. Like, oh, that's a different topic for a different story that's probably not on this podcast.
But I just wanted to relate it. Like, they're an old card game. They, are well more seasoned than this card game. And you'd think that you'd be able to see, like, these trends and be able to avoid them with your newer card game. But it's clear that Bandai right now is biting off a lot more than they can chew. Like, we're gonna start seeing a lot more crazy things happening. Like, we're likely gonna end up in a couple more Tier 0 formats, but they're not gonna last very long because you'll immediately move into another Tier 0 as we have the race towards unification. Which, is probably its own topic that needs to be explored later.
Yeah, the unification definitely is going to be very interesting to see what follows. Because, like, I was doing this thought experiment, and I'll eventually create a video where Nationals is the worst format of the year. And that's because a new set comes out, and it always has the most broken cards in it. And something right after Nationals always gets hit to try to fix it. It's like borderline clockwork at this point. It's like with the winter set also being like clockwork on how shitty the pull rates are. We saw it with BT7 and campaign rares. They did BT11 again with campaign rares. They didn't learn the first time, and they definitely didn't learn the second time. So instead, now we have LM cards to make things even worse for BT15. It's like we just, for whatever reason, they have these very weird patterns on just how bad things can go. And I'm not saying this as like a negative to the card game as a whole. It does some very good things. Like I thought BT13 was fire of not only just a set but a format. BT14 was also pretty fire. So like that was at least like half a year where the game was just flourishing on how good and healthy the game was. And then we get like weird decisions with promos that nobody agrees with, and we all try to push that off to the side, and I don't think we should, considering
we finally got the Pulsemon Tamer.
Yeah, it only took an
finally here.
Yeah, it only took an entire year, and it wasn't relevant in Japan, and it's not relevant here.
It's even worse here.
Yeah, but some of the DNA decks that I see up and coming, those are relevant in Japan, sort of, and those cards are not accessible and really expensive here. But I don't necessarily think outside of Ukamon, those cards are like pushed. Ukamon kind of is like the apex of like poor card design choices, where it's just like, okay, literally everything is starting to splash in Ukamon, both the promo and the new one that's coming out in BT16, because of just how good it is at making decks function. Like,
well, I think that again the problem is that like I think the design space that they had like envisioned was perfectly fine for those cards. Like they built an entire deck for Ukamon, so it has its own deck, which is fine. And I think it being colorless and it being able to go on top of any egg was fine, because in their mind, giving Bandai the benefit of the doubt, which we've seen, they don't think things through the best, right? In like when they give us this is an example of like what we expect a deck to look like with these new cards, and you look at it and you kind of like laugh to yourself, like nobody in their right mind, unless they are brand new to the game, would play a deck like this. Like this is laughable that this is what you believe a deck looks like, and I think that's what the problem is that like they're like, oh, we'll print a card to give consistency to any deck that needs consistency, because like we're not gonna bother to print everybody a searcher, like which we see even in modern card design, like.
And yeah, with the training cards, and I think part of the problem is when those types of cards are printed, they do basically irreparable damage to the entirety of the game, because now, like, in other card games are just as guilty whenever they print staples. Like, those are the most dangerous thing a card game can print, is a staple card, because now that's eating up deck space and design space in limiting you in terms of the designer on what you're able to do, which is where we get such broken things, because Anubis wouldn't be moving as fast as it was if it didn't have the training cards. Half of the decks just don't move as fast as they need to because they don't have access at the training cards because of the multicolor nature of it. Like, I would love to play Gamamon, but realistically I just can't, because he can't run the training cards. Therefore, he's not a good enough deck.
And you're a stack-based deck, which, like, to be a stack-based deck in this meta, you have to be able to run the training cards.
Yeah, and Ukamon's like the inverse for not stack-based decks, where it's just like you're not a non-stack-based deck if you can't run Ukamon to be able to just abuse what Ukamon is able to do with the raising area, and the fact that most hard play style of decks don't really use the raising area unless they have a specific egg. So that's kind of where like Divas could run it if they want. Dark Masters could run Ukamon if they want, but that's why like Numamon, even though it wants to try to be a stack-based deck because it has some tools where it doesn't need to anymore, it doesn't care about its level 3s and its rookies. So it uses that for Ukamon to up the speed and consistency, similarly to how stack-based decks use the training cards. And I think like between this combination of staples for the different style of decks, that's where the power spiking comes from in terms of like why we get such stupid things happening so quickly at times. So,
Yeah,
oh
it's
god.
interesting. When actually, I just forgot my train of thought.
Uh-oh.
I really did just forget my train of thought.
Yeah, but it's really interesting, like how certain decks are able to abuse staples and do well, and then others aren't. And that's kind of like where the defining line between what's competitive and what isn't kind of starts to blur. Or not blur, become more rigid and defined, because these staple cards, I honestly think, are some of the biggest mistakes. Like, it's not necessarily just the fact that a staple exists, because since BT6, we had the memory boosts, but not every deck was widespread using the memory boosts because of just how functionally different the game was, and like where the damage ceiling was at that time. And now it's just like, oh, I can't even run boosts because trainings exist and they do the same thing, but one's hyper efficient. And you see this package of like, I'm going to run 4 trainings, 2 boosts, and there's all of my options dedicated solely to consistency. And like, from a deck builder's perspective, that does get really boring, especially for single color decks, like knowing I'm just going to be starting with that and then going from there. It's just
Oh,
not enjoyable.
it's another reason though that like I was saying before that we're in these like greedy metas where weirdly enough this is one of the first metas where like you can swing with 1k bodies and be like
And
a
live. Yeah.
60% yeah like confident that you'll live like and so we did a lot of testing for the Nats environment and there'd be many times with your red hybrid where you'd be like, oh, let me swing with one of my tiny little weak flame mons in the hopes that it'll die so I can get my trash set up for my my um tamer
Takuya.
flame, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it would slam into a training card, and I'd be like, "Cool, thanks." And
Or
now with
Tamer.
armed with this, yeah, and now armed with this, I'll immediately go off and like you've doomed yourself because you gave me a single like training or tamer card at the wrong spot.
Yeah, and even just like I was doing some math in terms of like when you should training versus when you should digivolve, and it's correct 90% of the time in raising like turn 1 to not digivolve into champion and to play a training card, because the blind draw one isn't as good as the pick which one of these 2 cards that I want, and then you still have that blind draw one pocketed later. So you're seeing your cards, you have more opportunities to see your cards earlier to be able to get yourself set up faster. And yeah, a lot of the game is turning into this, not really greed fest, but it's almost greed fest, where just a lot of these stack based decks are just literally hiding, searching using these options or tamers, setting themselves up in whatever way they can, and then just having one explosive turn and going off. And I think like Digimon has some defensive tools where it's not exactly 100% that. Obviously, not every deck can do that, especially not every deck style. But there are just a lot of stack based decks where it's just like, let me just greed in the raising area, move out, and then do stupid stuff.
And I think they're trying to deter us from hiding in the raising because I think they've realized that trying to do anything to the breeding area, the raising area, is going to be a nightmare for them to develop new cards that like aren't insane if they can interact with it. And that's why we're seeing like if you're a modern deck, you're getting these very strong rookies. Like all of the new SR rookies from the last 2 sets are extremely powerful for
Yeah, like
when you
move
just come up
out.
and raise.
Yeah, move out, free evolution, move out, gain resources. Like
Hmm.
they're absolutely insane.
Right, and that did see us in an interesting and fun tech like advent where Digimon Emperor in the meta again for a little bit. For if you're a control style deck, like you can now run Digimon Emperors because sometimes people really wanted to get these cool effects off of these very powerful rookie cards.
Yeah, and that's usually they try to sell us the solution after the problem comes out, but they, for whatever reason, gave us the solution before the problems came out, because I think these SR rookies stuff is not really going away because, like, we've been seeing ever since Block 3 started these cards that are just able to just generate free value for doing absolutely nothing. And I think that's part of the problem on power spiking the game. Like, those in combination with the training cards is what's making things kind of extra stupid, because now if you're using those, you just gain so much extra advantage versus a deck that isn't, which is why, like, yellow vaccine, even though it doesn't have the damage output to be able to contend with other decks, it's still probably fundamentally one of the most broken decks that we currently have, because Patamon free evolution into like pay 1 evolve for, like, get a free evolution again. It's technically not, but for all intents and purposes it is. And, like, the value and resource of just being able to do that is really, really powerful at making decks move faster, which the idea might have been, oh, you have the ability to be able to respond faster because of this, but the inverse is also true, because you have the ability to, do more faster and hope the opponent doesn't actually have the response. And because not everything is created using that design space yet, not everything does.
Yeah. I think Patamon, though, is, like, the biggest offender, though, because he's completely parasitic. Like, the
Oh, he
fact that if he
cannibalized
comes up,
yellow. Yeah.
well, the fact that if he comes up out of raising, you say you never set up a TK, so you don't actually know that anything's there, but you go in, you get lucky, you hit something, cool. He gets the Evo, you get a draw because you're evolving. You also then trigger the remainder of the effect, which is to stack the security stack so that you can use the option if you have it in hand, or do another Patamon later. But then not only did you get to do that, we're, like, resolving that full effect for just starting your turn, starting your main phase. He then gives you a free memory because he saw you put that card back into the stack now that he is evolved. So nobody else does that. Like, the Agumon that evolves himself when he comes out, like, I had to have a base Greymon in hand and a Tamer on board. Like, I couldn't have, like, just done it. And then I don't get a free memory from it unless I'm running a very specific Greymon. Like, it's completely different. Like, the like versions of support that exist, right?
And not to mention, like, yellow as a color in terms of the themes and mechanics, almost everything good is a vaccine in yellow. Almost everything good. So it could just basically be splashed into every yellow deck that ever existed and be perfectly fine. That's where things kind of go wrong, and that's where yellow hybrids went wrong, was because yellow hybrids was the best yellow deck. It stayed the best yellow deck for a very long time because they just changed out the top end to whatever was the best level 6 at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was completely fine. Like, oh yeah, we just swapped out our level 6 to now run Venusmon because Venusmon was just the best next thing, and nothing topped Venusmon for a while, and they were just like, okay, we have to do something because this was, like you said, parasitic and cannibalistic towards what the entirety of the color is doing, and yellow vaccines is kind of headed in the same direction. So it's weird that, for whatever reason, Digimon always makes these same mistakes, just in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, that's, as much as I don't think we're never going to see another tier 0 accident like this again, I think if they don't have a change in their design philosophy, it's gonna happen. Maybe not on, like, rapid fire succession, at least not yet, but it's gonna keep happening because it's already been happening like clockwork. I know exactly when they're gonna do it based on the previous histories. Like, I have 3 years of experience to know like when things are gonna be messed up, and based on what we know of this year, the same mistakes are going to happen again, because look at the next winter set. It's going to be that hybrid combination. I'll just label it as Special Booster 2.0. It's just going to be another messed up set where the pull rates are going to be bad because it's overblown. Like,
Mm-hmm.
again, like clockwork. I think that format's also going to be the worst Nationals format because nobody's going to know what's going to go on, and depending on what cards they give us and what's broken in Japan at that time, the answer is going to be very clear towards this one specific deck. Like, it doesn't take a fortune teller to read the patterns that they've been doing. And I'm not saying all of these patterns lead to these tier 0 formats, because they don't. Sometimes they just nail it in terms of the power, the decks, the themes, whatever, and we actually have diverse formats, but usually that doesn't come towards the middle portion of the year. And
Mm-hmm.
the beginning and the end are always pretty bad because that's when things are changing the most.
Yeah.
So, any final thoughts before we wrap this up, because we are pretty close to time on this, and I feel like this was a pretty uh interesting discussion on just the tangents and where we went.
I think in general, to go off the generalized topic of tier zeros and what's strong and what's not too strong, I think we have seen plenty of issues of them not making the wisest of decisions with card design or deck design, and I believe you are, I don't know if it was you or someone stated, but I remember them saying that they must seem to not have very good like pre-testing before they come out with these card designs, and I think that's probably a good reasoning as to why that could be why we come out with these certain cards or decks. But we also have seen that they are able to make cards that are a more limited and more fair version. Like you said with the training cards, I was just thinking about it. The training cards, they're plenty broken because, or plenty unfair because of their cheapness, their two cost. You get a choice at two cards to pick for your reveal, and then you delay effect to go into something for reduction of two for that color. And it's just three really key hitting points all in one card that's super cheap, that makes that card so strong for any staple, for most staple stack decks. And but then you look at like these new cards that are going to come out. I believe it's in EX6. Could be wrong though. Is the scramble cards? The
Those are
scramble
more
Uh,
card.
promos.
they're promos, and we don't actually know how we're gonna get them, especially for
Oh,
yen.
okay.
Yeah,
But
unfortunately.
the point with those is they're not good at all. They're not as good at all compared to the training cards, but they're kind of almost designed the same way. They're two cost to play, but they their main effect when played or used, I guess we should say, is they reduce the cost of that color for the Digi Evolution by 3. So essentially, but you're paying 2 to use it. It's just reduced by 1, and your delay effect is to play I believe, Digimon from trash
Yeah,
that
it's a
is
rookie
2K
from
or less.
Trast.
It's
That's
a
a very
2K
balanced, very
body,
cheap card.
from the color. Mhm.
Yeah, and it's a very balanced, probably not used as much as training cards. Or I should say, I know it's not going to be as used as much as training cards, but they're pretty similar in design. That you can see the scrambles are a more balanced version, so you can tell that Bandai can make cards that are more fairly balanced, and we've seen the ideas come out, and they're capable of it. They just sometimes let it slip, or they just don't even test it or think about it too hard. You know.
Mhm. Their big thing is that they'll be slower because the main portion that you care about, being the Digivolve, it has to happen as you play the card. So you won't be able to do the same things that you do now with trainings, right? Being able to hide and raising. The one thing is that they realistically can't fit in every deck. It's going to depend entirely on the quality of your rookies that meet that threshold, that are 2K or less.
Or your Numamon.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Exactly.
want to. I mean, the card is still possibly usable. Like for example, I'm playing Machine Dramon right now, and I'm playing a Command Dramon base for the new BT14 Command Dramon protection. You
hmm
know, and I could tech that card in there because I can play it, go into a machine or a Chaos Dramon for like almost 2 or 1 or whatever, but then with the Commandramon base and I have that protection, if I seem to not have a Chaosdramon on the field and I need another one out to proc my protection, I can use the delay effect and then proc a Commandramon out. It can be used in certain decks, but it's not something like the training cards that are going to be used in every single stack deck because it's such an essential card, especially if you're stack based.
I think, though, with the other component that we forgot to mention is that you do have to trigger your delay at the start of turn, which is interesting in itself, but you get to pick one colored Digimon from your trash to put back on top of your deck.
If you don't have anything, yeah.
So I think that these cards were probably initially conceived to be the answer to, like, Apocalypse to some degree, where, oh, your, like, WinCon got milled. Well, with this card, you can, at the start of your turn, pick it back up, put it back on top of your deck so that you have it and you can actually go off.
Yeah, they've
Like,
been playing around with like when delays trigger, and I think that's cool. But I think like what makes like going into defining tier 0 in terms of interactability, we with all of these delay abilities, we actually need a way to be able to interact with the card sitting on the field in a more meaningful way. Like the idea of delay, just having the card sit on the field for a turn before it's used, gives us that ability to be able to respond and react to it. But because right now we don't have anything that enables us to, therein lies the
we have
problem on the cards just
one
getting.
thing,
Oh, we
but
do?
it's you'd have to Omnimon all delete is the only way that you can, in theory, right now remove delay cards. But that's a big ask, right? I have to have a level 7 on board that I'm going to remove and give my opponent. I'm
10
gonna
memory?
have to
Yeah.
spend 10 memory for it. Yeah, but we do have something, like, it exists, but it's a big ask. But yes, that is my big thing that I put onto the survey. Like, they finally started listening, I felt like, to to my survey request, because a lot of mons that I've been asking for since I've started playing this game have finally started showing up in the card game. And so hopefully other people were also asking for option removal for onboard options.
Yeah. Like that's
I think
part of what is making some of these decks accelerate to that tier 0 is their abusability of not only just their inline stuff but the other stuff. But go ahead, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say with the option removal, I hope that they don't go too heavy with the option removal. And to explain is when we were finally getting into metas where tamers were really starting to become an issue and a pain, that I believe it was a set before is when it really became noticeable. The BT8 Megatron, I believe it is, where you can delete tamers that are 3 costs or less, and but we were slowly getting
That was in
more cards like
BT9.
that
Yeah.
Megatron. Was
Blackware
it because
Greymon was BT8 that deletes Tamers. The Megadramon came out in BT9, and then Blackware X with Hades Force really started to cement it. Like, and we technically had a little bit of Tamer hate with BT7 using Lucimon
Lucimon?
Chaos Mode.
Chaos mode, yeah.
So like there is a fine line between how much I want to make for this specific type of hate, because yes, too much can render the cards completely irrelevant, and then it just creates this like really weird cycle where it's just like, okay, nobody's running them, so now the hate cards are really bad, nobody plays it, then they come back, and it's just a really awkward cycle of on again, off again. And as a player, that's not good, because now you're just guessing if it's going to be on again or off again in order to tech it and build your deck correctly for competitive events. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like
I think because we're also not in a point right now. If we take the idea of option removal, theoretically, it's only going to affect options that have delay effects that you play, and we don't have technically that many. We have a good handful, but not enough to warrant
I think they're being
the
like the few that we
excessive
have.
need of it.
I think the few that we have is being ran at a widespread frequency, and the explosive nature of the decks just warrant something
We
to
are
be done.
getting new ones as well, right? We're seeing that we're gonna get two new faction based ones. We're
Yeah,
gonna have a couple others.
Like, it seems like in order for them to make an option playable, it needs to have a delay effect. Like, that's the big takeaway that it seems like they have learned, where it's just like it's either a big splashy removal card or it's a good utility card that has a delay ability, or sometimes both.
hmm
You know, and I hope that we do get a removal soon. You know, I think especially with these training cards that we got are a big factor. I think training cards are really, really annoying. Like especially when you're going against a Fenrir and you see two of them just sitting there for like 2 to 3 turns, and you're just like, "Yep,
Yeah, the
he's just
fact.
waiting to get that right draw to just go ahead and kill me that turn." But I hope that when we do get whatever first form of removal we have for options, I hope it's just not too strong. I hope it's kind of just like a Megadramon almost in BT9, where it hits one and it's fairly cheap. It's not hitting nothing too crazy, but it's also not something you can easily access right away. But also isn't like like a Zork defeat where you got to go into a level 7.
hmm
Yeah, I think like with the current pace of Digimon, it seems like they really are struggling with understanding their own tempo of the game and how it's fundamentally played on a higher competitive level in order to design cards properly around that. Which, granted, that's designers will never ever be able to get that correctly, and Magic tried to hire pros to be able to start designing cards to be able to cater towards that. But even then, that still kind of didn't work, and it had its
Well,
own level of backfire. So,
I
like,
think the
they're.
big
Oh, go
problem
ahead.
there with Magic, sorry, was that they shifted focus. They honestly don't care about standard like at all, and they've shifted to the fact that their biggest profit margin is from people that play a different format. So that's what they cater to now. So even with the insight of those like pro players, like more of the sets and more of the card design space is catered towards like a different demographic, which is unfortunate.
That's fair. And right now we don't have multiple different formats to worry about
hmm
that, but there's still just this fundamental lack in understanding in terms of how the pace of the game is played, because when we get into these tier 0 categories in terms of how strong a deck gets, usually the most egregious thing that all of them have in common in every single one of them, yes, is the level of uninteractability, but it's also they're abusing some sort of speed or tempo shift that currently wasn't there that enables them to be what they are. So like the fact that Ogremon, just as an example, Ogremon and Goblymon from BT14, like, they weren't really being abused until Anubis came out because he just discards, and because of his discard engine, now he's gaining memory, making his cards free or like extra cheap. And that's where it seems like a lot of the problem stems, is just how efficient certain cards can be in the right combination. And sure, granted, they don't have the hindsight to see their entire library and pick each individual card based on the interaction, but there's some very clear design mistakes when it comes to when a card is designed to be able to accelerate the tempo of the deck to an unhealthy degree in combination with other cards. So like, because Anubismon we wouldn't be complaining about Anubismon if the fact that he didn't do it all for basically zero, going all the way up his evolutionary chain and playing everything, netting him a total of like what, 1 to 3 memory is what you're usually going to spend on that entire move, starting from a rookie, mind you.
hmm
Yeah,
So that
like
that seems to be the
understandable.
big problem in where the tempo is, because uh Black War Greymon again, BT11, just reduce 2 memory. Cool. There's a Greymon that's 2 colors, so it basically makes this way cheaper than it normally should be. So those are just where the design mistakes are happening, is just a fundamental lack in understanding of the tempo of the game. But to round things out, to answer the question on what do we define as tier 0, there is no correct answer. Everything is just, everyone has their own unique answer to the question. And as far as in the context of Digimon, it's more of just factors rather than just a hard set definition. At least that's kind of where I'm leaning on in terms of like the best way I can give an answer.
I think I can agree, and I think people need to remember also is that Digimon is a very high factor game. There is a plethora of factors when it comes to a plenty of subjects when it comes to the game Digimon. You know, it is not so one dimensional. Um,
Yeah. And like Headless said earlier, the game is a resource and value based game, and any deck that's able to cheat on that is like already a contender for being one of the better decks in the entire game.
Yeah.
So I think this is a good place to stop. I felt like this was a pretty interesting conversation. Definitely some good tangents and definitely some good answers. So at this time, I want to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the podcast, please, as well as all of the other social media stuff, share this podcast on social media to be able to spread it. And thank you all again for listening, and we will see you next time.